Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we hear from Firas Maksad, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. With the US election just days away, we ask if the Arab American vote can surely impact the race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump for the White House. Plus, as the crisis deepens in the Middle East, what's next for Lebanon? With most of Hezbollah's leaders gone, is this the end, or could they return more dangerous than ever? And will the international community allow another Israeli occupation of Lebanon, or are they powerless to stop it? Mr. Maksad, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Now, the US election is less than 2 weeks away, and an Arab News YouGov study has shown some very interesting results in an Arab American voter trends. Namely, there's quite a slim margin between those voting for former US President Donald Trump versus those voting for Vice President Kamala Harris. Tell me, frankly speaking, were the results surprising to you?
Hello, Katie. It's good to be with you. Yes, they were surprising. First, I would start by saying there are some really healthy findings for the community. The fact that the willingness and excitement to vote far exceeds that of the general American population. And so it's a sign of health that the Arab American community is so engaged in the democratic process here in the US, particularly when there are times when there are concerns about discrimination and racism. Top line findings here, the fact that they are so evenly split is surprising. The sense has been that, particularly given what's happening in Gaza and now Lebanon, that would have an impact and that would dampen the vote for somebody that is so staunchly pro-Israel like Donald Trump. But clearly that's not the case. Clearly here we see that the Arab American public generally reflects the same trend here as the American public, because so many of these Arab Americans are not newly naturalized. They're second, third, fourth generation Arab Americans. Some of them came here in the mid 1800s, and so they very much reflect the general sentiment in the American population.
Well, you say that, but despite the majority saying that they do plan to take part and that they do feel their vote will have an impact, historically we see that the Arab vote doesn't really matter when it comes to the American elections. Is that still the case, or has something changed?
Not the case at all, and obviously that's not the case because of where they are, where that constituency is. States like Michigan that are going to be crucial, but even in Georgia, a significant population. Close to where I am in Washington, D.C. is Virginia, and there's a significant population there in Northern Virginia. And so although the Arab American community is a relatively small community, perhaps some 1% of the general American population, in contested elections, so tightly contested as they are today, and the most recent polls point to almost a neck-to-neck race, not only at the general national level, but in the pivotal swing states like Michigan and like Georgia and Pennsylvania and whatnot. I mean, the difference here, the margin is 0.5% one way or the other. So that makes the Arab American vote a crucial one, a crucial constituency to win. And we see that reflected in the positions of the various campaigns and the efforts to cater to and to win over that segment of the population.
And it is a very slim margin, isn't it? What I also found very interesting was that for the average US Arab American voter, the fact that Gaza actually ranked as a higher priority compared to the US economy. Now, do you think that's accurate? Is it the case that foreign policy in places like Gaza or in Lebanon, of course, where you're originally from, actually matter more than day-to-day personal well-being in the US?
And you're absolutely right to zero in on that. That was perhaps the point that most caught my attention. And we all know that in polls and surveys, what you ask and how you ask it is crucial in the kind of response that you get. So when asked point blank, about the significance of Gaza, most Arab Americans rank it as the top issue. However, that doesn't seem to reflect in their overall choice. I mean, you would expect that not so many of them would be voting for President Trump, who's so clearly pro-Israel, who moved the American embassy to Jerusalem and allowed Israel to annex the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights. So I think here there might be some tension between when asked what Arab Americans think about Palestine, what they say, and the fact that they're Americans that have livelihood to worry about, the economy being chief amongst them, but also things like immigration for so many women, also issues relating to their reproductive rights and abortion. So I was a bit surprised by that, but again, so much depends on how the question is being asked and what the respondee want, what kind of image and impression they want to give.
Well, despite 40% of Arab Americans who were polled, they consider themselves Democrats and only 28% were Republicans. But a slim majority is going to vote for Donald Trump. Tell me, what does this mean, particularly when we consider that Trump is seen as much more supportive of Israel?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the question has been out there as to whether some of this is a protest vote against the Biden-Harris ticket or team for their inability or lack of a political will to rein in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But again, what's sort of puzzling about this is that if this is a protest vote, you wouldn't necessarily vote for Trump because he's even more pro-Israeli for all the reasons that we've already discussed. You would go to a third-party candidate like the Greens. So I don't know how much of that can be prescribed to what has unfolded in the Middle East. One would also have to think of all the other factors having to do with immigration and the economy. Immigration seemed to very interestingly rank very high on the minds of Arab Americans, which, honestly, as an immigrant myself, I was not completely surprised by, because those who immigrated here legally and went through the process and paid the taxes tend to feel pretty strongly about those who are cutting in line and not paying their fair share. So yeah, so illegal immigration here, which often plays in favor of Trump rather than Harris, could also be a factor.
And of course, the polls don't always get it right. Where do you think we're placed just a couple of weeks away from the election? What do you think this poll really represents in terms of the sentiment we're seeing amongst Arab Americans versus the entire population today?
Yeah, I mean, I think top line here, Gaza and events in the Middle East, clearly very heavy on the mind of the average Arab American voter. But at the end of the day, it's American Arab rather than Arab American. They have to vote based on bread and butter issues, the well-being of their families, the issues that impact them at home, rather than issues that have an impact overseas. And to me, that's not surprising. And it's not surprising, again, when you look at the profile of that community, and that so many of them are third, fourth generation Americans. Some of them don't even speak the mother tongue or Arabic anymore. They are American first and foremost. And that's my big headline takeaway.
And I think you make a very interesting point there. But let's turn our attention now to the region. Huge events, of course, this week, particularly when we consider the unfolding disaster in Lebanon. Tell me, were you surprised at the shocking level that Hezbollah has been seen as incompetent with the recent Pages attack, as well as the precision operations that have taken place against the leadership? Do you feel that this signifies that Iran might have sold out Hezbollah, or that Israel has successfully now infiltrated it?
Well, Katie, there's certainly a lot of people that feel that way in times of danger and uncertainty. Conspiracy theory is the currency that people deal with, and so this general sentiment in Lebanon and even amongst Hezbollah's own support base is that the Iranian level of support has been, at the very least, disappointing. Now, public sentiment is one thing, and the reality of things is sometimes another. And I think that Iran here has sort of always showed some level of support to Hezbollah, not to Lebanon. but has not been willing to stick its neck on the line, so to speak. It fights through its Arab proxies. It has a very clear aversion to be directly involved in a conflict with Israel because of its technological and military inferiority. And so, for many veteran watchers of the region, that's not a surprise. But for many Lebanese, particularly Hezbollah supporters, it's disappointing.
So, what happens next in Lebanon? Because, frankly, we are seeing a lack of leadership. There's internal displacement from the south, internal divisions. Most people feel that this war, which has already taken many lives and livelihoods, really it's been imposed on them. It feels like this has now become a recipe for a civil war. Wouldn't you agree?
It's probably one of the most underreported issues here, and I'm very thankful that you brought it up. The domestic tensions, the domestic dimension of Israel's war in Lebanon. We often talk about the regional angle, we talk about Hezbollah and the military dynamics of what's going on. But you have over 1 million IDPs, internally displaced persons in Lebanon. That's about a quarter of the population, and about a quarter of the country is under evacuation orders from the Israeli military. The domestic toll for a relatively weak country suffering still from the weight of an unprecedented economic collapse in 2019, where most people lost their life savings in the banks, is tremendous. And the fact that those tensions fall often along communal cleavages, and that you have a predominantly pro-Hezbollah population that is now being displaced into areas that do not support Hezbollah and do not appreciate that their country has been dragged into a war on behalf of Hamas. And that in many ways, kind of Hezbollah has essentially wagered the country's fate on what's happening in Gaza and the fate of Hamas and its leaders. So yes, that is an underreported issue. It does not bode well longer term for Lebanon. And the longer that this conflict drags, the more we have to concern about those kind of ground up bubbling of tensions and the instability that might result in.
And even before the most recent crisis, so many people in Lebanon were living below the poverty line. We've seen the currency plummet in recent years. We've seen medical shortages, energy shortages too. But there's now been a lot of talk about the major role of longtime Speaker of Parliament Nabil Berri, what he can play in potentially unifying the Shia and being able to mediate with Hezbollah. Now, he's received calls from both the French and the Americans, but let's be honest here. On the other hand, he is 86 years of age. He has a lot at stake if he miscalculates his moves. Tell me, what do you make of the current analysis and attention on him?
Yeah, I mean, Speaker Berri is a focal point, whether we like it or not, of what will unfold, and in the potential restructuring of the Lebanese body politics. But he can't do it alone. Druze leader Walid Jumblat is a key player. Certainly, Christian leader Samir Jaja. There's a void in the Sunni community. The prime minister right now, Najib Mikati, is a key player. But obviously, since the assassination of which Hezbollah is a suspect of Rafiq Hariri, the former prime minister, there's been a void in the Sunni community, and it's been hard to replace that. But all these kind of political dinosaurs, if I may call them. I mean, Berri and Jumblat and Jaja, those were all around during the Civil War in the 80s and are still active players on the scene. They have long memories, Katie. They remember in 1982 when Ariel Sharon initially announced a limited operation into Lebanon and then ended up invading all the way to Beirut, upending the political system, facilitating the election of a pro-Western president. But that very quickly, Iran and Syria launched their comeback, assassinated Bashir Gemayel, the president at the time, and by 85 had pushed the Israelis all the way back to the south. So Iran and Hezbollah have time on their hand. They tend to be persistent, and they have strategic patience. And these local players, Berri and others, remember that, and they're going to be moving very slowly, and they're going to be taking their cues from the regional capitals of influence. What is Tehran willing to do, and how much of a fight is it willing to put to reconstitute Hezbollah and its presence in Lebanon? And how about Washington and Paris and the Arabs, and how willing will they be to step into Lebanon and play a role there? So I think any significant changes in Lebanon, including the election of a president after a 2-year vacancy, that's going to be a slow process, and it's going to depend on many outside factors.
Okay, well, let me ask you about Hezbollah, because with most of its leaders and their deputies killed or severely injured, do you feel like it's now game over, or could they still come back even more aggressive and dangerous than before?
It's certainly not a game over. Hezbollah has been significantly weakened. It's on its back foot. It's very, very interesting to see the impact that that's had and what kind of changes this is resulting in. Hezbollah is fighting in a more decentralized way right now. Particularly, we see that on the border, in these border villages, their fighters are still, carrying a punch to the Israelis when it comes to a ground invasion. So still putting up a fight there. The central leadership is fragmented. Cannot even articulate clear political positions in many ways, kind of relying on Speaker Berri to manage the politics in Beirut. So I think on one hand, what we're seeing is kind of a decentralization with the fighting groups on the grounds and the villages continuing to put up the fight. But Hezbollah Central Command is increasingly likely to come under direct Iranian management and control, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And we have to ask the question, with a central and powerful figure like Nasrallah now gone. Nasrallah had a margin of maneuver because of his role and stature in the community, but also at a regional level, given the group's involvement in various theaters in Syria, Iraq, Yemen. That's now gone. And I think that very much then opens the way for more direct Iranian control, command and control of Hezbollah in the months ahead.
Well, Hezbollah aside then, do you see a scenario where the international community can accept another Israeli occupation of part of Lebanon? And frankly speaking, is there anything they can even do about it?
Well, Katie, I don't see the political will where I sit in Washington, D.C., to really do much on in terms of Israel. Israel, as you know, is not only a foreign affairs issue, it's also a domestic issue in the United States, particularly during an election year and a tightly contested election, as we were saying. So although the US has the leverage, I argue it doesn't have the political will. Now, that said, the Israelis themselves fully understand the disadvantages of a lengthy occupation in Lebanon. I think most still do remember the heavy toll on them during the years of occupation that ended in the year 2000. And so what I keep hearing is that Israel is looking to mop up Hezbollah infrastructure, tunnels, and otherwise along the border, perhaps maybe even occupy for a short period of time the key villages, because the topography of South Lebanon is such that so much of these border villages are overlooking Israel, and they want to take the higher ground, the Israelis here, and maintain control, and then perhaps begin a diplomatic process and negotiations for a new security arrangement, loosely based around UN Security Council Resolution 1701. So I don't think we're looking at a lengthy occupation. However, unfortunately, we are looking at weeks and maybe months of conflict ahead still.
Now, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries were very quick to send humanitarian aid to Lebanon, but we haven't seen any breakthroughs in the deteriorating diplomatic ties, which have been severely harmed by Hezbollah's malign activities in the past. Do you feel like there's now grounds for rapprochement now that Nasrallah is out of the picture and that there are better ties with Syria and Iran?
Yeah, I mean, the Saudi position and that of other Gulf countries is very interesting, because I think that they have taken the approach of hedging their foreign policy priorities and relations. And that hedging includes Iran. There's been questions in recent years about the US security commitment to the GCC region, given an increasingly isolationist trend in the United States, and talk about ending forever wars and pivoting to Asia. And that has rightfully caused countries like Saudi Arabia and others to want to diversify their foreign policy options with Russia and China at the international level, and at the local or at the regional level, normalizing relationship, opening that bandwidth with Iran and even Syria at some point, while at the same time talking about the potential of normalization with Israel, should they be open to a two-state solution and giving the Palestinians their right to self-determination. So I think that is part of a sort of a broader strategic approach that the kingdom has taken. I don't see any significant changes yet, except that the war in Gaza and now Lebanon, the longer that drags, the less likely that we're going to see any progress on normalization with Israel.
Tell me, do you fear we could be on the brink of an all-out regional war breaking out? You know, Mr. Netanyahu has made it very clear he has no plans to stop this war. Is there anything that can stop him?
Well, Katie, thank you for asking that question, because we've talked about Gaza, we've mentioned Lebanon. We really haven't talked about sort of the broader prospects of an Israeli-Iranian war that then can drag the rest of the region, and certainly the United States and others. And I think that is not impacted by the recent killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. The killing of Sinwar is a potential fork in the road. It can open up a diplomatic process where maybe Netanyahu can then reclaim the mantle of Mr. Security, having killed Sinwar, and then begin to seriously negotiate about a swap that would see the Israeli hostages released. And we all know that a ceasefire in Lebanon was premised on a diplomatic outcome and a ceasefire in Gaza. And so then arguably Lebanon can begin to move in that direction. Iran, however, is on a completely separate track. We are all anticipating the Israeli response to Iran, the last missile barrage. I think that it would be significant but fairly limited, the Israeli response, before November 5, before the US elections. But I do think that this could be a multi-stage conflict. And so one would anticipate the Iranian response to the Israeli response. And once we get past the November 5th date, I think Bibi Netanyahu will have a much freer hand for a second round of attacks that can then maybe take a toll on the nuclear infrastructure and the oil facilities in Iran. And then that opens up Pandora's box. So we're continue to be in a very uncertain period for not only Gaza and Lebanon, but for the Iran and the region at large.
And I think the nuclear issue is obviously the huge growing concern for many of us also based in the region as well. Mr. Netanyahu has made it very clear he has no plans to stop this war. Of course, big celebrations in Israel this week with the killing of the Hamas leader. But I think, when we look at really where the future holds, you called it a Pandora's box. How close are we to that tipping point?
I think we're very close, and really nobody truly knows the answer to that question, except the Israeli Prime Minister himself. It's not President Biden that's in the driver's seat. It's nobody in Iran or some of the other players. They may all have a role, but I would argue it is relatively marginal compared to that of the Israeli Prime Minister. He's had escalation dominance all along, willing to escalate the conflict more than Iran and its proxies are, and is taken advantage of this moment in the United States where, again, you have such a closely contested election and a lack of a political will. So, this is the moment of truth for Benjamin Netanyahu. Is he going to use the killing of Sinwar, and before that, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and everything that preceded that, as a moment to capitalize on his military victory through capping it in a diplomatic outcome, take the diplomatic off-ramp, and prepare for perhaps what could be domestic elections in Israel? Or does he see this as his golden moment to go all the way with Iran and reset the table across the region and readdress the balance of power? I think only he can answer that question.
And I think that's the big issue. We know that if the war in Gaza finishes, Netanyahu is very likely to face those corruption charges. He's made it very clear he has no plans to stop this war. But tell me, final question for you. Let's go back to the US elections. We've obviously talked a little bit today about the Arab News and the YouGov poll and what that suggests. But I'd be very interested to know, which candidate does Firas Maksad want to win? And who do you think is going to win?
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to share with you who my favorite is and
This
who I
is a
will
safe
vote
space.
for. But I could tell you that in terms of what I expect, it is an extremely tightly contested elections. If we're to take a snapshot look at where the polls are today, and I took a look at them this morning before appearing on this show with you, Trump seems to be gaining momentum. And Harris, although she had a significant bump after her very solid performance in the debates, in these key swing states, in these 7 states that will determine the outcome of the elections, Trump is now edging her in every single one by somewhere between half a point to a point, which is within the margin of error. In every poll, it's within the margin of error. It's that close, which is makes it very difficult for people like me to predict. But there does seem to be some momentum here behind Donald Trump, even though the national poll still has Harris ahead by a couple of points. But we all know the U.S. elections are ultimately not decided by the national polls, or you might have the majority of voters, but it's the electoral colleges in these various states that's going to determine the outcome. So that's where we are as of today.
Okay, so if I'm understanding what you're saying currently, you're predicting a Donald Trump win. Tell me, what does that mean for the Middle East?
Well, I mean, the sense is, whether rightfully or wrongfully, is that President Trump is a much more forceful figure, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. Everybody here recalls the Abrahamic Accords, which many did not think were possible, and they thought that his son-in-law Jared Kushner was out there, fishing with very little to show for it. And there's that sense that, in this promise that President Trump has kept repeating, that he will end those wars, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza. We will have to see whether he will make good on that promise. His relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also a troubled one. It's not only President Biden that has a troubled one with Bibi Netanyahu, but whether he's able to bring Bibi Netanyahu to heel on issues that the U.S. wants to see in terms of settling these conflicts and ending this war is an open question. But many do feel that he's more well placed to do that than a president.
Well, November 5, just a couple of weeks away, we'll be finding out then. Mr. Maksad, thank you so much for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. I know it's a busy time for you, so we appreciate your insights today.
Thank you.